Welcome to the feature series, How Roger Penske Changed the Indy 500 on the Marshall Pruitt Podcast, which celebrates the most successful entrant at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway on the 50th anniversary of his first event in 1969. Presented by Cooper Tires, the Justice Brothers, and Bell Racing Helmets, a long-standing partner of Team Penske. This 15-part series spans some of the greatest drivers, managers, mechanics, engineers, and the man himself, Roger Penske, to document the captain's vast influence on America's defining motor race, the Indy 500, and in many instances, the sport as a whole. We'll also be joined by a reporter who covered Penske's Indy debut a half-century ago and some of his fiercest rivals, many of whom admit to being fans of the 82-year-old icon. Our guest in this episode of How Roger Penske Changed the Indy 500 is author Jade Gurss, whose fantastic book, The Beast, chronicles the unbelievable efforts expended by Roger Penske and Ilmor Engineering, along with the precarious nature of the project, which could have failed on multiple occasions, to produce an unbeatable stock block engine for the 1994 Indy 500, which Unser Jr. would go on to win for Team Penske. Jade Gurss, you wrote yourself a pretty awesome book, which makes sense because you're pretty awesome at writing books. Your fantastic piece of work, both investigative, storytelling, celebrational, all manner of awesomeness surrounding what many of us saw, and maybe many who, if they weren't there or weren't fans, weren't even alive, have since learned about 1994 Indianapolis 500 and a motor actually called the Beast. So while we are celebrating Roger, Team Penske and their 50th anniversary at the Speedway, I figured you would be the perfect person to take us deep inside the idea, the formation, the execution, and the final outcome, absolute clobbering of the field in 1994, which you spent untold days, hours, months, years researching for your book. Let's start with where this piqued your interest as a piece of literature to create.
Well, with an intro like that, I'd better be pretty darn good. So thank you, Marshall. I actually attended the 94 race simply as a fan. So I saw it and heard it in person, but I didn't know the real story. And through a course of action, I actually was hired several years later by Ilmor Engineering, which was the engineering company, the race engine design and build company that created and designed the Beast. And we would go to team dinners and guys would have a drink or two, and suddenly these unbelievable stories would just start flowing from them about what it took to build that engine and what it took to keep it secret from everyone else. And I thought this is amazing. Someone has to tell this story. And so the sort of the idea, the kernel of the idea was placed 96, 97. And then Paul Morgan, who is the Moore of Ilmor, sadly, Paul passed in 2001. He collected and greatly flew World War II, vintage World War II planes. And sadly, upon landing on one in 2001, he had a crash and was killed. And I mean, I was heartbroken because I loved Paul. But I was also heartbroken because I felt like he might have been the key cog in the whole story. And I kind of felt like a lot of that story died when Paul passed away. But jump forward a decade or more later, and I had become friends with Paul's son, Patrick Morgan, who's also a very fine engineer. And he and I were just kind of BSing, and he made a comment about, boy, I would sure love to know what my dad did on that, on that project for that engine in 94. And it was almost like just, a push over the cliff, or if you're on a roller coaster, it was pushing me over the top. And it just struck me that I had to do this story. I had to tell it right and get the word out. And I was very lucky because I had worked for Ilmor A lot of the people that I interviewed knew me and were comfortable with me. So I think in a sense, I got a lot more insight from them because I think they trusted me enough to open up and, and tell things in a great manner. So that's the long story of how I was inspired to start it and how it came together.
Looking at how this has become the defining how Penske changed the Indy 500 topic and subject, and it's one of many, don't get me wrong, there's so many aspects in those that we have spoken with for this series, but when most people think of Roger Penske and some sort of wild, crazy thing that he did to push performance and expectation at the Indy 500 beyond any previously accepted measure, the beast is it. Why don't we start, Jade, and I'll have you fill in some of the background on where USAC's rules had changed and opened up some doors for consideration. Why don't you start us where what had become almost bespoke 2.65 liter single turbo V8. There were some Buick V6s in there, understood, but by and large, there was one displacement, one style of motor that had just become standard practice across a variety of engine builders at the 500. Why don't you start us off with the point in time where there's a rule change and some options to play outside that box emerge, yet nobody decided to take that up, at least immediately?
Yeah, the Speedway had always had its own set of rules, which were fairly similar to what the rules in kart or champ car or whatever you want to call it. They were very similar, but the Speedway had always wanted to keep the legend alive of the Speedway of being open to the little guy, being open to a variety of innovation or a variety of power plants. And that had kind of become moot in a way because it was primarily the very powerful and similar Ford Cosworth or the Ilmor, then Ilmor Chevrolet. The Buicks were kind of the odd man out in that they were very fast over a lap or two, but they were very brittle. Up until the 93 race, only one Buick had even completed the full 500 miles. So that was the sort of the scenario, but with some urging from arguably General Motors, the Speedway had altered that rule to remove the words stock block from the rule that would allow a Buick, let's say, to run higher boost, produce more horsepower from a smaller package. And that was the change that perked up the eyes and ears of Roger Penske, as well as Paul Morgan and Mario Ilian of Ilmor. And they had a dinner after the 93 Indy 500, which Penske had won. And and all of them knew that this small change to the rule meant that it would now allow a company such as Ilmor, with Penske's backing, to build an engine to this rule package that was not limited to being a stock block or an engine that you had pulled a block just off the assembly line, which might be great for a passenger car, but really was just simply not built to withstand the sheer power and the power needed to run competitively at the Indy 500. So it was this very subtle change that opened the door. And so Roger, along with Morgan and Ilian, had a famous dinner in the desert in Arizona, where they decided we must do this before our other competitors at Ford or Buick were able to do it. The other twist was that Honda was coming to Indy, and Ilmor had raced against them in Formula One, and Honda basically did whatever it took. They spent whatever it needed to have a dominating engine, and Ilmor was they were terrified that Honda would come aboard with unlimited funds and build an engine to this new subtle rule change. So it was part paranoia, part competitive edge, but they decided they had to do it. They had to do it quickly. They also had to do it in a top secret manner to not allow their competitors time to respond or to build their own version, the Ford Cosworth version or the Honda version of this non-stock block engine. So that was the real genesis. They all decided this was what it was going to take for the 94 Indy and beyond with this new, again, it was a very subtle rule change by the Speedway.
In a classic Roger Penske move, if we fast forward to the conclusion of this story, Jade, we are talking about the Penske chassis and the Mercedes-Benz engine winning the Indy 500.
Yes.
This was not, as you just shared, although Mercedes-Benz branding was indeed on the valve covers and in print and television ads and whatnot. In this meeting in the desert and the decision to go forward in the classic Roger Penske move, this was not going to be cheap. This was going to be, if anything, one of the crazier modern undertakings, not only technologically, but financially as well. And there was no sponsor behind it then. And yet the captain said, let's do it. Share some insights about that before we start to move into the design resources and what, how folks came up with this 209 cubic inch monster.
Yeah, it's funny. I mentioned earlier about how open and trusting everyone was, but I never got anyone on the record that would share with me the budget. I don't know why that is, but I never really got a handle on the full budget. My best educated guess is it had to be somewhere in the 10 million range, which, with 10 million, you could run a whole team, a whole season at that point, and run it very well. But it's interesting to me that no one ever admitted to what that number was. But you also had Penske, who was committed to winning. It was the winning on the racetrack that was the halo for his entire brand, all of his auto dealerships, his truck leasing companies, Detroit Diesel. And so to him, winning, the success on the track really brought a halo to all of his businesses. So to him, it was a business decision that applied or that gave benefit to all of his other businesses. And you're correct. Mercedes came aboard very, very late. And Roger was attempting to develop a relationship with Mercedes, both for Formula One and in IndyCar. So the rumors are that Mercedes didn't pay a cent to come aboard and put their name on this engine, that it was mere chance to prove to them what capabilities Penske and Ilmor had. And it proved to be fortuitous for all of them business-wise. Mercedes won Formula One championships with Ilmor and really came aboard in kart and did very well there too. So it was really smart business on Roger Penske's behalf, even though it was hugely expensive and risky. He thought it was worth the risk.
Since 1954, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway has served as the proving grounds for the world's most legendary helmet brand. From Jimmy Bryan to Mario Andretti and Helio Castroneves, Bell Helmets has and continues to protect some of the all-time greats. Follow the journey on social media at Bell Racing HQ or by visiting bellracing.com. So this moves into what I think might be one of folks' one or two or three favorite aspects of this program, this stock block pushrod V8 one-off, call it, built just for Indy creation, and it's the clandestine aspect. So there's a famous Roger Penske line about, and maybe you can share that with us, about telling the team about keeping this secret and how, it would be like forfeiting money and whatnot. But share with us how we go from this meeting in the desert to, okay, we need to come up with a design. Now, keep in mind another thing, too. So we're talking about after the 93 Indy 500. Ilmor also needs to build a regular 2.65 liter V8 for the 1994 season. So it's not just a case of this will be our single motor that gets used throughout 1994. This was also a project where we have the standard motor that would be used throughout the IndyCar Championship. Plus there's this giant one-off motor that is being prepared for the 500. Tell us some stories about how this gets moving and how it's kept under wraps and who's doing what conceptually to at least lay down the initial lines of what it might be.
Yeah, and don't forget they were also doing Formula One engines at that time, as well as designing a new Formula One engine. So it's and Ilmor, it was at that time, still is actually a very small company relative to what people might think of some massive, industrial company. They're very small. And so it was decided early on that the only way this could happen was to use the absolute fewest people and to keep it a secret within that small group. Even people that during the day would work side by side with these folks had no idea that when the place closed for business on a normal business day, those involved would essentially stay and work even overnight on this new, this new massive engine. So there were a lot of people in England, or actually not a lot. There were a few people in England that didn't get a lot of sleep for the next 9 months or so to put this together. And another element, a quote typical race engine would take roughly 18 months to go from the first pencil on paper to the first race. These guys only had 11 months to get this new project together and to get it ready for the 500. So it was sort of this superhuman compressed timeline with a limited number of people. Mario Ilian is still considered one of the finest engine designers in the world, and he really put together the outer parameters of the engine and then let his team take off. And they would do things like the crankshaft, for example. The process to make a crankshaft was 23 weeks. That was the longest time frame to create a part. So it became the very first item that had to be designed and then sent to start being constructed.
Almost so half a year.
Yeah.
And if you find something you don't like, and or maybe there was, I don't want to call it a design flaw, but maybe you got the radius wrong here, and in dyno testing something broke. Yeah. So you wait almost half a year, 40% of a year, and you sure hope it's perfect, because if it isn't, you're sitting here staring at, I don't know, Christmas, Labor Day, who knows when you're going to get the next.
And that was the pressure, and they knew that. They knew that if this crankshaft failed, the project was done. It was off. They were not, they were aware of that, and they recognized that. So the solution, which turned out to be an intense design solution from Mario Ilian, was he promised he would design the beast to fit exactly into the Penske chassis, just as the other, quote, regular V8 engine would. So the theory being, if the pushrod engine failed, then they just simply put the, quote, regular engine back into the chassis, and off they go. So it was really, Mario Ilian admitted it. It was insane to try to put 38 pounds of feed into a 30-pound bag. It had to fit exactly into the chassis as the other engine did. So you have all of these design challenges and elements before you've even drawn a line on paper or began to produce parts. So flying by the seat of their pants is definitely a part of the story, and the fact that they trusted each other immensely. Everyone had their project, and nobody needed approvals or go through any sort of process to slow it down. They just did it. They had a phrase called JFDI, which meant J, just effing do it. And so it really that attitude permeated the whole thing. They realized a failure, even a minor failure, could essentially knock the whole thing out. And that's another reason to keep it a secret. Why herald and announce this great new project when it very well could completely collapse and not be able to run at the Indy 500? So that was the background upon the beginning of the design and construction.
So in addition to dual motors being created by Ilmor, we have this glorious Penske PC23 chassis being crafted in the background that I would say might not have been as highly promoted in terms of success of what the Beast did at Indianapolis. But if you look at that 1994 season, boy, that chassis as well was sublime. So it was a great point, Jade, that in what they were doing with the Beast, a motor going from the 161 cubic inch 2.65 liter V8 turbo to the 209 cubic inch. I mean, these are two motors with different sizes, different footprints, different everything, and actually designing a car that could accept, or designing the engines that could be accepted in the same chassis as well. Yes, this was more than just carving up lumps of metal and throwing some cylinders into the bores and going off to play motor racing. So let's talk about initial concepts for this stock block, crazy high boost, good Lord type motor. What were some of the power projections, torque projections, just some of the guidelines they were hoping to exploit? Because ultimately, that's the reason they did this, right? It wasn't just, oh, here's a loophole we could play with. It's, if we can get this to work and live, in theory, we should beat the living heck out of the 2.65 liter V8 turbos.
Yeah, absolutely. The current, at that time, what I call, quote, the standard or normal engine was producing about 760 horsepower. At the dinner in the desert where they decided to do this project, Mario Ilian promised Roger that this would produce at least 900 horsepower. That was his sort of back of the envelope sketching out, or a rough estimate. So that was the goal, was to go in with this huge amount of advantage in hand. And so that was sort of what they were hoping for. In the development of it, I will say that when it first ran on the dyno, which was designed to check the horsepower, the torque, and all of that, it was greatly disappointing. It was just above 800 horsepower. So they were terrified that they would have gone to all this effort and produce something at great expense that really did not give them much of an advantage at all. And they struggled with this for quite a while. And one of the big brains at Ilmor, a gentleman by the name of Jeff Williams, who had been a university mathematics professor, came up with this crazy mathematics that sort of went against current knowledge, or it went against what Mario Ilian believed to be the laws of physics and the laws of building an engine. And despite Mario's protestations, they went ahead and built a new version with these specs and figures. And all of a sudden, they put it on the dyno, and it exceeded 1,000 horsepower, which just thrilled them to no end. And they decided at that very moment that they would do nothing more to try to improve or increase that horsepower, that now every moment was devoted to making sure that this engine would last 500 miles. And believe me, that was a huge challenge. It proved to be very elusive until very late in the game. But you had very disappointed guys at the start, and then once this change was implemented, suddenly they knew they had this monster that, according to their figures, was producing 1,024 horsepower. That was the maximum that they had measured. So it truly was a huge advantage as far as power.
And this only adds, Jade, to the depth of the achievement. So externally, if folks were unfortunately not able to read your book, The Beast, there might be an impression that found a loophole, threw money at it. First thing off the floor was brilliant, made a zillion horsepower, went and conquered the world. Not the case at all. There were so many points where a bad decision here, wrong decision there could have tanked the entire project. And even in this instance, and maybe you can share some thoughts on where this Mr. Williams' thoughts and this comprehensive redesign came in on the timeline, trying to get ready for the 94 race, because that in and of itself is a holy cow. You had to kind of sort of go back to the drawing board. I thought it was just brilliant from day one.
There's a great conversation that Jeff Williams shared with me where they had come to him and they said, we need this to be looked at. And he said, very well, that will take about 6 months. And they said, no, you have 3 weeks. And it's this great contentious debate that Jeff, being the very deliberate professorial kind of chap, he wanted to really delve into it, and he simply didn't have the time. They simply didn't give him the time. But there were part of the book is about how they would test things, they would break things, they would go back and work overnight to try to solve the weakest link. And to jump ahead in that progress, they announced the engine in mid-April of that year and began practice early in May without that engine, any of those engines having turned 500 miles of running. So they were absolutely going into the great unknown when practice began for the 500. Now, what they were also doing, while they were practicing for the 500, they would have the test team at Michigan running tests concurrently. And finally, the engine did pass the 500-mile mark the week of the first week of practice for the Indy 500. So, again, I attended as a fan, and to my eyes and many others, it looked effortless. They were dominating. But great joy of the book for me was to really tell the story that this was anything but easy, and it was anything but a completed deal to get it to the finish. So that to me was fun. There were also so many legends and myths because the engine appeared out of nowhere and then disappeared. So a lot of those myths I was able to either disprove or to put some facts behind them, and really show what a Herculean task it was.
So another aspect of this, which again just contextually is well worth pointing out, be one thing if they said we are going to do an engine, and so we're going to have the primary engine, we'll have a couple of backups, but really we're just putting all of this effort into really going for the overall win with one entry. No, we're talking 3 entries. We're talking Unser Jr., Paul Tracy, Emerson Fittipaldi. So if we're also thinking back to a time where spare chassis were not only allowed, but were allowed to be fully built up with motors in them ready to go. So you could, in theory, be testing one chassis one moment at the 500 or Michigan or elsewhere, or practicing in, and then jump in the other one. We're talking about a rather large production effort here as well, Jade, to outfit 3 cars, to go test, to have them practicing as well. You share any insights on what that was like? Because you mentioned the word Herculean. Yeah, this wasn't a one giant bullet. This wasn't a single shot gun with a giant bullet in it. This was multiple bullets, and you're having to feed the backup gun and test here and test there. This sounds like an organizational nightmare, but also something that we need to honor as well.
Yeah, in fact, I've had people say, "Well, this is a business book. This is about logistics, and this is about how you do business right at high speed, but with top quality. You've got to do it right the first time, or it's not going to work." You also had Ilmor was designing and putting the parts together, building the parts in Brixworth, England. Penske shop at that time was in Reading, Pennsylvania. Then you had the all the cars suddenly testing in Nazareth, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Which, by the way, at that time, Roger Penske owned both of those speedways, which was very convenient. And so it was massive. It's mind blowing what was going on and how many moving pieces there were to do that. And some of the testing stories, the first test was done at Nazareth after a huge heavy snow. They had to have the city come in and clear the track. Crew had to stand on top of snowbanks to watch the car. Unser Jr. and Paul Tracy wore snowmobile suits, these insulated snowmobile suits, just to begin the testing. So it wasn't a walk in the park. It wasn't a sunny summer testing session. It was done through the winter and all climate conditions. There was nothing easy about any of the elements of this, and all with one goal in mind, and that is to build this engine to last 500 miles to get to the finish line of the Indy 500.
So let's share some insights, Jade, from those initial tests. So the drivers that we have mentioned, they have all experienced very powerful engines, some with Formula One experience, or even, whether it's Emmo as a Formula One world champion, but both Little Al and Paul, I believe, in or around this point had tested in Formula One. So these are all men who are accustomed to having their head just pinned into the headrest under acceleration and whatnot. What were some of the types of feedback that were coming from the drivers, and what were some of the Ilmor team engineers giving you in terms of what they were learning about this crazy motor?
Well, Al Unser Jr. was the first to test it, and it was clear from day one that this was really an amazing engine. Even on the 1 mile oval at Nazareth, the goal was just to get laps to find the weak points. And Al was thrilled from day one. But the real workhorse, I don't think he gets enough credit, is Paul Tracy. Paul was kind of the young gun, as you'd say, and actually did the majority of the testing of this. And Paul, everyone kind of knows Paul. His attitude is, I'm going to get in and I'm going to drive this, as fast as I can and go for it. And they went through just an unbelievable amount of failures. It was almost like a checklist. All right, this is our weakest link. We're going to rebuild it. We're going to redesign it. And then we're going to move on. And it just kept going and going. And as I had said earlier, it kept failing. It had never done 500 miles by the time the practice began for the 500. And it just was this task of finding the weak spots and making sure that they solved those. They also had huge trouble with the electronics of it. The whole engine control unit and all of that was a huge problem that didn't get solved until early May. So there were, however many parts on that engine, that there were probably an equal amount of failures or troubles that they simply had to keep solving day by day. One of the fascinating things for me is Brixworth is not very close to Heathrow Airport. So what they would do is Ilmor would design and build a new part overnight in Brixworth, England. In the morning, they would load Paul Morgan's P-51 Mustang World War II plane. They would load the wings, which used to hold all the bullets for the guns, with these parts, and Paul would fly it to Heathrow Airport, drop it at the freight, and they would be put on the Concorde. The supersonic Concorde was still flying. They would fly on the Concorde and arrive in New York City at 9 a.m. New York time. The Penske people pick it up, go and literally put it in the car that morning. So this is literally how their parts truck was a World War II plane, a Concorde, and Penske's drivers to drive it back to the shop. So that was the level of logistics that this was operating upon day after day.
As we start to round towards the finish line here, Jade, of the other aspects that I think folks have come to love, and maybe you can share some anecdotes of this as well. So you mentioned on the dyno seeing a peak of 1,024 horsepower, 4-digit horsepower, sustainable horsepower as well. Well, at speed, that power is going to be recognized in mile per hour. That also, granted, that kind of power, Jade, might not manifest in 4-digit mile per hour, but it sure kind of sort of seemed like it, like we were doing some warp speed type performance. Can you share some of the feedback from the drivers and some of the numbers that were quoted at Indianapolis Motor Speedway in practice, in qualifying, etc., with what the Beast was able to do in terms of straight line speed?
Yeah, and again, Roger was terrified of playing all their cards. They didn't want to show the full potential of the engine. So they would never allow the drivers to run a full lap flat out. It was literally, they would do 2 or 3 corners and then they would lift off. And in those days, the timing and scoring at Indy was not as advanced as as it is today. Today, you would see a segment time and realize they've clearly let off. They've not gone full blast through whatever corner or straightaway. And that was a lot of stress for the drivers. They wanted to test it. They didn't know what they had if they were to go a full lap. But with Penske's setup and data, they estimated that the top speed on the back straight was 252 miles per hour, which the best quote from that was Emerson Fittipaldi said, "Do not tell me what that is in kilometers. I don't want to know what that translates to in kilometers." It was just an immense amount of speed, but that was just one of the fun things that they were mathematically working on the backstretch. And Emerson, he didn't want to really know how fast he was going into turn 3 there. So they had a lot of that. They also discovered that Paul Tracy had come in from a run, and the tire engineers looked at the back tires, and they use markings to line up the tire with the wheel, and those markings had moved. The tires had moved on the wheel. It was so much power. And they said, "Look at this, it's moved 2 inches. And Rick Neer said, "No, it's 2 inches the wrong way. It has gone around the entire wheel." And Rick said, "And we don't know if that's just one rotation or many." So they ended up finding a local shop. They had to sandblast every one of the wheels at the bead to get it to connect where the tires wouldn't spin around on the wheels at speed, which is just the best example of how much torque this thing had. It just exceeded the capabilities of the tires. So come race day, they again were not only worried about the engine, but would the Goodyear tires, would they last? Would they be reliable? So it was just another sort of element of the problems that 1,000 horsepower would cause you at the speedway. So there was no shortage of amazing things they had to overcome to make sure it would get to the finish line.
So looking at what was achieved on race day, this was, we could just simply call it Roger Penske's Indy 500 with 30 other guests invited to watch Roger Penske Indy 500. All of the work all of the money, all of the creativity, all the effort, all the logistics, everything that went into this for, 11 plus months of thought, design, and development was achieved. And granted, little Al's win, Al's second Indy 500 victory, is fantastic. He did not necessarily dominate the day within the team, but this was something where if you go back and watch the race on YouTube or read about it in one of the annuals and such, this was the absolute epitome of Roger Penske changing the Indy 500.
Yeah, and later after the race, everybody knows about the split to the IRL versus Champ Car and Kart. All of that really happened, which makes the Beast sort of the last great. I don't want to say innovation, but the last great unfair advantage at the Speedway. From then through now, as great as the racing is right now, it is still within a very small technical box. Everyone has the same chassis, two engine manufacturers running very similar programs. So the sort of the romanticism of Beast being the last great innovation at Indy, or the last great outlier at Indy, I think only enhances sort of the allure or the mystery of the engine. So it really stands out in that way historically as well. I think, and will continue to be for many years to come.
Let's wrap on a bit of a postscript, Jade. So we have this amazing result, this all-conquering motor that allows Team Penske to own the 94 race. Also, we should say completely demoralize every other team, and especially every other manufacturer who realize that this level that things have just been taken to, such a Penske thing, in order for us to compete and win potentially at the world's greatest motor race, our most important race, the ones all of our sponsors pay us money to succeed at in particular, the level of expectation now is possibly out of reach. Can pick a team back then. Could a very young Chip Ganassi Racing commission, I believe they were using, in 94 to have been the Ford Cosworth. Can they, as a team with Target, commission for Cosworth to build a stock block for them, just them? Could a Walker Racing or any of the others go to a specialist engine manufacturer and say, hey, I need a Beast for 95? I'm sure that they could have found folks to do it, but none of those teams had the financial resources to take things to that level. Tell us, again, a bit of a postscript of how this utter Penske domination of 94 led to a rather rapid one-and-done rulemaking decision based on a lot of pressure from the rest of the paddock.
Yeah, and there's a lot of that in the book. As you said, the other manufacturers, the other teams, there was no question that in this scenario you had to have an engine of this type to compete, and the expenses would have been astronomical. So the Speedway's first reaction was to lower the level of turbo boost for an engine of this configuration. Mad scientist Mario Ilian, once that rule came out, sat down and began running the numbers, and still believed they could have an advantage over the sort of the quote typical engine. And they actually began producing new blocks. They also said, we never tried to maximize the power of the Beast. Now that we have a full year to hone and to really maximize it, we're still going to be fine. We're going to really still have an advantage. And I think when word got to the Speedway that they were producing blocks and preparing to do it again, I think there was some panic at USAC and the Speedway, and then they made a quick second rule change that really lowered that turbo boost greatly, which then meant it was moot. That this form of engine would not be competitive. So technically, it wasn't banned. It was simply regulated to a point where it would not be worth effort and the expense of building, all new engines for everyone. And in retrospect, and Ilmor and Penske were very unhappy with that at the time, but in retrospect, realized it's probably best for the sport as a whole that this sort of arms race was avoided. I think it would have just been astronomical in cost for everyone and really not a sustainable business model. So that was how it became moot for years beyond. So again, it was announced to the world a couple of weeks before May. It came in, it won the pole, it won the race, and then suddenly was no longer competitive. So it disappeared. It was really a one and done, both ONE and WON, one and done. And that, again, adds to this allure and the myths and the rumors and all of that. It was, 6 weeks in the spotlight and then gone forever.
Another interesting postscript to this as well. The concept, the idea of the Indy Racing League that debuted in 1996, 2 years after this victory, it had already been in motion. This is something where talks, meetings, you name it. This was something that had already been hatched as a concept by Tony George, son of the owner, or basically the Indianapolis Motor Speedway owning family. I would say that this crushing victory by Penske, though, certainly codified the belief that there needed to be a new way and a different way. And as often happens in the world, there was a drastic reaction to this, which manifested not necessarily in 96 when it was the first, quote, IRL 500, but in 97, where we did have, although they weren't spec, they were low cost, lower tech, lower everything chassis from Dallara and G-Force, Oldsmobile production-based engines, Nissan as well. There was definitely a bit of a snapback reaction to what happened in 94 in what was ultimately chosen in terms of rules for the upcoming IRL as it took over the 500 and the cars that it started to race that, honestly, we are still in the midst of that legacy today. Wouldn't you say, Jade?
Yeah, I agree. And I'm glad you mentioned that because the book puts into context the sort of the rumblings and the beginnings of the split. A lot of fans said, oh, well, this is what caused it. And you are very correct in that it was definitely happening or being designed and begun behind the scenes. And this was sort of, I don't know if you want to say the final straw, but yes, I think it was something that it was not appreciated by the Speedway, and it really sort of informed their view of rules moving forward from then on, from 95 and 96 onward. So it didn't cause a split, but it definitely did have an impact on the way that the IRL rules and the way that's developed as far as a rules package moving forward for the Speedway.
And that's definitely why I continue to point to this in this series as really the one defining thing we can say Roger changed the 500. Both from an amazing standpoint, right? Those are the things we remember, I think, more than anything. The huge peaks of, oh my goodness, did you see when that thing happened? There's also, again, there's often a bit of backlash too, which we continue to feel. Well, final thing here, Jade, and I'd welcome your thoughts on where you believe this answer falls. At least in my conversations with Roger Penske over the years about 94, I've received his thoughts and feelings of pride and appreciation for what was achieved with the overall project, hatching this plan, making it happen, and then it winning as desired. I think I might have also felt and received equal pride in one of the underlying, or maybe it's the overlying aspect of keeping the darn thing a secret for so long. So somewhere between those two, I think the winning maybe didn't surprise Roger so much. The fact that they were able to keep this under wraps and shock the living bleep out of folks when it was announced right before the 500 in April of 94. Where do you think that sense of pride and accomplishment maybe falls either most heavily, or what was your take on that?
Oh, I agree with you 100%. I think it's a very prideful thing for Roger on so many levels. And I know in speaking with Mario Ilian of Ilmor, it is his greatest achievement, or I think it's the thing he is most proud of. And Mario has designed Formula One World Championship engines and still designing the Ilmor Chevrolet for Indy these days. I believe they're going for their 20th Indy 500 win as an Ilmor with Ilmor, and yet this does stand out, something which will forever be their legacy, no matter what great heights they all achieve. And Roger has heights in a lot of aspects of business. This stands alone as a great story, a great human story of what one can achieve with the right leadership and the right approach to what looked to be impossible, but turned out not to be.
Jade, thanks so much for taking time, my friend. And as I mentioned in the intro, your book, it is a gift. And I don't say that about a lot of racing books. There were once upon a time many motor racing books written on an annual basis. Yours, although it isn't that old, has definitely continued to be a gift for those who are wanting to learn more or just wanting to crack open a brand new topic and learn about it for the first time. We've seen almost nothing like it in IndyCar ever across its 100+ years of history. I don't know if I'm going to see something like it again in my lifetime. The fact that you, Roger, Ilmor folks, so many people were willing to crack this open and share it, and we can go and buy it and read about it. Definitely a big thanks to you and your talents and passion to make the beast happen. So I hope folks, if nothing else, are curious and go and pick it up and read it, because they'll be doing themselves a favor.
Well, Marshall, thank you. This was a great honor. I loved chatting with you about it, and it's very rewarding when people enjoy the book, and it was a great story. I'm lucky enough to be the guy that got to tell it.
And that was how Roger Penske changed the Indy 500. You can catch this series in more than 500 episodes at the brand new MarshallPruittPodcast.com site. All brought to you by Cooper Tires, the Justice Brothers, and Bell Racing Helmets.